Okay, y'all, we're going to ignore my husband. I just did a take and had to ditch it. So I'm starting over. 2026. Victory Red lipstick. Victory Red. Needs to be reissued, but I want it in the Maybelline ink so it doesn't smudge or smear off. I found a way to tell you why some good old boy in Texas named Sandy Levinson's name was on my refrigerator. He did a testimony to the Senate, and testimony belongs to the public, belongs to the government, so it belongs to the public, so there's no copyright. So I can read to you in his own words. And YouTube should have no issue with it. So, Sandy Levinson in Fault Lines in the Constitution talks about structural changes that need to be made. I did a cold reading a few minutes ago, got into it, so this is my second pass for part of it, and then we'll be back into a cold reading. So you're warned. And this is going to take as long as it's going to take. This is maybe a little bit of reaction. This amendment that he is arguing skillfully for did not pass. But I buy into his argument. So let me show you. Okay. Professor Sanford Levinson. I don't know what the W stands for. W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Jr., Centennial Chair in Law and Professor of Government, University of Texas Law School, January 27, 2004. See, I told y'all, he's a good old boy, Texas boy. So I'm going to play adult story time with you guys and read this. I won't be doing teleprompter thing, that forced faux eye contact thing does weird things to me. But I'm okay with manuscript style reading. So we're going to do it a little more deliberately. That whole north of divergent. I'm not neurodivergent, but I'm also not neurodivergent. So, testimony of Sanford Levinson. That's his legal name, right? Before the Committee on the Judiciary of the United States Senate, January 27, 2004. I will be probably doing a dramatic reading. That's what I did a minute ago, right? I've watched Sandy enough to know that he's grandpa. He's calm. He's polite. His name is Sanford Levinson. I have, since 1975, taught American constitutional law. First at Princeton, and then, since 1980, at the University of Texas Law School, where I hold the W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Jr. Centennial Chair in Law. I am co-editor of a casebook on constitutional law, processes of constitutional decision-making, and I have written many other books and articles on one or another aspect of American constitutional law. Good old boy, I'm telling you. More to the point, though, is that one of my special interests has been constitutional amendment itself. I have edited a book, Responding to Imperfection, The Theory and Practice of Constitutional Amendment, Princeton University Press, 1995. I have also taught seminars on constitutional amendment at the University of Texas and Harvard Law Schools. During the spring semester of 2004, I will be co-teaching a seminar on constitutional design at the Yale Law School. From a professional point of view, therefore, it is a special honor and privilege to be testifying before this distinguished committee this morning about designing a constitution adequate to the challenges presented by this new millennium. But I also want to convey my particular pleasure at the fact that this was my home state senator, John Cornyn, who invited me to testify. As the senator undoubtedly knows, I am a strong Democrat. In the current atmosphere of American politics, I would not ordinarily be singing Senator Cornyn's praises, nor, I suspect, would he be calling me as a witness. Parenthetical. My prior testimony before the State Judiciary Committee on September 4, 2001. Wow. That was just before 9/11, wasn't it? On September 4, 2001, was at the invitation of Senator Schumer, and I defended the propriety of senators taking into account the ideology of judicial nominees, a position that I know Senator Cornyn disagrees with. Close parenthetical. But for me, the very point of this morning's session is to underscore the fact that the issue addressed by Senator Cornyn, the adequacy of our Constitution to meet the occurrence of a truly catastrophic loss of members of the Congress, is both of extreme importance and without a trace of partisan tilt. I cannot think of an issue less subject to being analyzed in terms of a Democratic position or a Republican position, a liberal one or a conservative one. Truly, we can address the issue as Americans united in finding the best solution to what can only be described as a ticking time bomb, a metaphor based all too plausibly on the dangerous reality of the world we live in. I have no doubt that there will be disagreements about the details, particularly with regard to the implementing legislation also before the Senate, and, I trust, to be the subject of other hearings. But once again, I would hope that any disagreement is untainted by partisan politics. Remember, I wrote on my refrigerator, what if Sandy was right about everything? You're digging in with me. We're painting a picture of Mr. Levinson's political philosophy that's over 20 years old. And he's still talking about it. YouTube him, or YouTube search him. I mentioned earlier that I had edited a book titled Responding to Imperfection. That title comes from a letter written by George Washington to his nephew, Bushrod Washington. I'm just going to say Bubba Washington, who would later become a distinguished member of the Supreme Court of the United States. George Washington, of course, was the single person most responsible for there being a new Constitution at all. He became president of the Constitutional Convention because it was his unimpeachable stature that convinced doubters in the first place to support the Philadelphia Convention itself. That same stature would help persuade the citizenry to ratify the Constitution. One would expect Washington to take special pride in the Constitution. No doubt he did, but accompanying justified pride was an ever-timely reminder about the Constitution's limits as well. Thus, it's especially important that it was Washington himself who wrote that, quote, "The warmest friends and the best supporters the Constitution has do not contend that it is free from imperfections," close quote. Fortunately, when inevitable imperfections do manifest themselves, quote, "there is a congressional door open. The people, for it is with them to judge, can, as they will have the advantage of experience on their side, decide with as much propriety on the alterations and amendment which are necessary." Should the point not already be clear enough, Washington went on to say that, "I do not think we are more inspired, have more wisdom, or possess more virtue than those who will come after us." Quoted in Levinson, Responding to Imperfection, page 3, emphasis added. I have emphasized the words "the advantage of experience" because it dishonors the memory of those we call the founders, of whom Washington is surely one of the greatest, to believe that they, in fact, believed that they had struck off an absolutely perfect document that would never need be scrutinized or changed. Indeed, the very existence of Article 5 is the best testament to that belief. One might well believe that amendments should be rare and that the proof of burden should be on those proposing them. but it rejects the very wisdom of Washington and the other members of his generation to believe that amendment is unthinkable, or even that an unrealistically high burden of proof should be placed on those who propose amendment. The proposed 28th Amendment is not only thinkable, it is, to borrow from a key phrase in the Constitution, absolutely necessary and proper, inasmuch as it would contribute to maintaining the integrity of the constitutional system itself. To maintain otherwise, frankly, I believe, is to play the ostrich by putting one's head in the sand and hoping that things will turn out for the best. Oh, Sandy, 20 years down the road. Yeah, that didn't serve us well, did it? Okay, back to the reading. Everyone in this room and across the nation experienced in his or her own way the catastrophe that we call September 11. Fortunately, that did not include the destruction of the Capitol that may well have been the aim of the United Airlines flight that went down in Pennsylvania. But it would be foolish indeed to discount the possibility that something similar might happen in the future. More likely, one suspects, is a bioterror attack, but surely that is almost beside the point. That was parenthetical. I had the privilege yet last year of attending a truly frightening event co-sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute and the Brookings Institution, which have been studying together the problem of continuity in government. It's going to take as long as it takes, y'all. I'm getting through this with you. My fellow witness, former Senator Simpson of Wyoming, is, of course, a co-chair of that commission. What struck me as a non-Washingtonian, remember he's from Texas, who, however, now has a daughter working in Washington for the United States Department of Justice, was the near certainty expressed by a number of the distinguished participants that Washington would be subject to a full-scale terrorist attack at some time in the foreseeable future. Jan 6 come to mind, anyone? What in many ways was just as frightening was the demonstration. I believe beyond reasonable doubt that the American political system was ill-designed to cope with such an attack if it did, for example, decimate the membership of the Congress. The framers of the Constitution, of course, envisioned the possibility that both the president and vice presidency might become vacant and therefore empowered Congress to pass a Succession in Office Act. I strongly share Senator Cornyn's view that the present act itself is gravely flawed and should be amended as soon as possible. It, too, contains elements of a ticking time bomb. Fortunately, correcting its deficiency does not require a constitutional amendment. All it takes is congressional leadership, and I strongly commend Senator Cornyn for supplying that with regard to the Succession in Office Act, as well as the proposed amendment. Why, with regard to succession in Congress, do we need an amendment instead of a simple corrective legislation? The primary answer lies in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 4, which specifies that when vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority shall therefore issue writs of election to fill such vacancies. This is universally read as prohibiting any other method of filling vacancies in the House than election, which obviously differs from the ability of governors to fill vacancies in the Senate through appointment. This emphasis on elections probably makes a great deal of sense in normal times. Alas, as Senator Simpson has demonstrated, it makes little sense when contemplating the kind of disaster that some enforce the proposed amendment that we are discussing. We must imagine, as difficult as it is to do so, circumstances where dozens, even hundreds, of vacancies are created simultaneously in the House. It is, I presume, close to a self-evident truth that continuity in the government of the United States must be preserved under any and all foreseeable contingencies. It is especially important that such continuity be preserved with regard to the Congress, which is the branch of our political system most directly responsive to we the people of the United States. Obviously, the United States would need a strong chief executive in any such circumstances. But it is equally important that the United States would need a Congress fully capable of functioning. Full capability combines both political and legal dimensions. Should, for example, an attack kill 125 members of the House, especially if they're from particular states or a single region, one might well doubt, as a political matter, that the House was fully capable of functioning. But no strictly constitutional problem would arise. Imagine, though, that an attack killed 218 members of the House, half the House, right? Then, as a constitutional matter, one might well argue that it could not function at all, inasmuch as Article 1, Section 5 requires that a majority of the membership of each House is necessary to perform its business. If one reads this as applying only to living members, then there would be no problem, but this would then leave open the possibility of the House for a significant period of time being governed by a small minority rump. Nice word choice, Sandy. In theory, it would allow a single survivor to possess all of the power enjoyed by the House in our system of government. There is, however, no formal legal solution to the problem of incapacitated rather than killed members of the House or Senate. Should majorities of the living members be incapacitated, the quorum problem would be insoluble. And note well, one would need quorums in both houses in order for Congress to function. Bills obviously need the assent of both House and Senate. Should we, then, be faced with a Congress that is unable for whatever reason to function, it is almost a logical and most certainly an empirical truth that power would flow to what can only be called dictatorship by a presumably functioning executive branch. After all, imagine that the president believes that special laws are necessary in the wake of an emergency. In our system, it is Congress that makes law. But if there is no effective Congress, then holy crap, Sandy, then I dare say we would simply accept fiat rule by the president, the definition of dictatorial rule. As we are told with some frequency, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and there would be few, I suspect, who would be sharply critical of a president who stepped into the breach and declared himself or herself to be a Roman-like dictator. Indeed, if one looks back at the history of the Lincoln presidency, when he had to make awesome decisions during a time that Congress was not in session, and because of the realities of travel in 1861, could not return to Washington for some weeks, he behaved more to preserve the Union than to honor every last jot and tittle of the Constitution with regard to the limits of presidential power or devotion to the prerogatives of Congress. One can hope, obviously, that such presidential rule in the 21st century would be benevolent. But if there is any single message conveyed by the founding generation of the Constitution, it is the importance of preserving institutional checks and balances rather than relying on the hope that we will be governed by extraordinarily self-disciplined leaders. Most people believe that Lincoln is unique among our presidents in his capacity for such discipline. As Madison noted in The Federalist, it is precisely the fact that men or women are not angels, or even Lincolns, that makes it necessary both to form government in the first place and to place limits on what any given government official can do. I trust that no one of any political party would lightly accept the possibility of presidential dictatorship. The proposal and ratification of the amendment before you would be at least a partial protection against such an ominous event. Concomitantly, to reject the necessity for such an amendment is to say that one would almost gladly accept the near certainty of presidential dictatorship. should the state of emergency ever arise or be fabricated. My words. I can understand the appeal of elections as a means of providing for succession, especially in the House. Congress is important, after all, not only because it provides institutional checks on potential executive overreaching, or because its judgment is necessary before proposals can be dignified with the name law, but also because the electoral process makes it especially responsive to the people. It was no doubt the importance of maintaining such responsiveness that led the framers to require that all members of the House be popularly elected, unlike the original system with the United States Senate or the process gubernatorial appointment that comes into play when a senatorial vacancy is present. Yet the 17th Amendment, which eliminated legislative appointment of senators, is ample evidence of our belief that popular selection of political leaders is essential. We should, however, be minded of the adage that the enemy of the good is the best. It would be a true tragedy if a fixation on what is in fact an unattainable best system, which we can all agree would be popular elections soon after the kind of catastrophe we are envisioning, prevents Congress from proposing, or the states from ratifying what is in fact a truly good addition to the Constitution. It is, to quote the constitutional text yet once more, absolutely necessary to make sure that there is an alternative under special and terrible conditions to waiting around for many weeks and even months for special elections to take place in states that themselves might have suffered terrorist outrages. Having elections requires not only the state institutions operate effectively, it also, and just as importantly, requires candidates who can actively campaign and put their ideas in front of a focused electorate. Slapdash elections in times of crisis could even be worse than no elections at all if, for example, many people could not effectively vote because of institutional problems, and the campaign, such as it was, took place in an atmosphere that prevented any serious discussion of the catastrophe that triggered the need for special election in the first place. The amendment, of course, is remarkably simple. It only authorizes Congress to provide for a system to fill vacancies in both House and Senate that might arise in the event of catastrophic decimation of membership. For better and worse, it does not tackle the more difficult questions of how precisely such vacancies should be filled. Frankly, I can imagine no basis of opposition to the amendment, since the alternative leaves us at the mercy of those who would try to destroy our government. One might, as I was initially tempted to do, view this as a problem only with regard to the House of Representatives, inasmuch as the very same 17th Amendment that requires popularly elected senator authorizes states. I think there's a flaw there, inasmuch as the very same 17th Amendment that requires popularly elected senators, I'm going to say plural, authorizes states to authorize their own governors to appoint temporary successors who can serve in the Senate until a special election can be held to fill the vacancy on a more permanent basis. The universally accepted meaning of this part of the amendment is that it applies if and only if there is a vacancy that occurs in one of three specific ways: death, resignation, or expulsion by the Senate itself. But the problem that presents itself to those who think of a catastrophic attack on our institutions as often involves incapacity as death. That is, think of a catastrophic attack on our institution as often, that is, one can imagine things ranging from physical injuries generating shock and disorientation to long-term comas and the like. The 17th Amendment does not speak to those possibilities. I suppose that clever lawyers and I use so-called scare quotes advisedly, might argue that a permanent incapacity acts as a constructive vacancy and that licenses replacement by a state's governor. There are two major problems with this argument. First, as suggested by the scare quotes themselves, most people, including, I dare say, most lawyers, would regard this as too clever by half, since this just isn't what most people, including well-trained lawyers, think of as the condition of creating a vacancy. It is the kind of cleverness that, for some people, gives lawyering a bad name. Secondly, and just as much to the point, many of the incapacities are likely to be temporary rather than permanent. Think, for example, only of President Reagan in the immediate day or two following his attempted assassination by John Hinckley. So the most crucial question before us with regard to the Senate is to address the possibility that a significant number of senators could be incapacitated rather than killed. We might take a lesson here from the 25th Amendment. Mr. Levinson's writing style is exquisite, but he doesn't put paragraphs in, so we're going to pretend that's the end of a paragraph and the beginning of a new paragraph. The Constitution speaks clearly as to what happens in the event of a president's death. It did not, however, significantly address the problem posed by presidential incapacity, a potential danger every bit as great as presidential death. Indeed, prior to the 25th Amendment, one could well argue that incapacity presented a greater threat than death. Just imagine, for example, that Lincoln or John F. Kennedy had not died immediately, but instead had lingered, as did Woodrow Wilson at the end of his presidency, in a stupor for months on end. Oh. It is, I am afraid, like whistling past the graveyard to ignore such possibilities. Indeed, the institution of which I am most aware, the United States Supreme Court, has scarcely been immune from them. Emory Professor of History and Law David Garrow, several years ago, published a remarkable article in the University of Chicago Law Review, Mental Decrepitude in the U.S. Supreme Court, the historical case for the 28th Amendment. It gives the location of that. It's fall of 2000 if anyone wants to find it. One might argue that the difference in numbers makes the threat or reality of incapacity of a single senator less dangerous than is the case with regard to a member of the Supreme Court. But if anything, the threats to our political system posed by the incapacity of significant numbers of senators or representatives would be far greater. And for that matter, I trust that future attention of this committee might be focused on incapacitated judges as the result of a catastrophe, which might also require thinking of a constitutional amendment if the requirement of good behavior is viewed, as has been traditionally the case, as inapplicable to defects in mental or physical health. Thus, there should be legislative mechanisms in place to allow for the temporary replacement of senators and representatives who become incapacitated by virtue of a systematic terrorist attack or other similar catastrophe. But such legislation requires constitutional amendment in order to legitimate it, even if one can barely conceive of a legal argument that would allow, say, a state governor to declare, though by what procedure one is tempted to ask, that a Senate seat had become permanently vacated because incapacity. It is impossible to go to the next step and allow the government to fill the seat only until the senator in question has recovered. Or should we say, until the governor believes the former senator had recovered, regardless of the views of the former senator, him or herself? This is not an absolutely untenable reading of the 17th Amendment. It is also a recipe for potentially disastrous acrimony. It is absolutely essential that there never be doubt about the legitimacy of our leaders, particularly in times of crisis, And this requires a clarity that can only be achieved first through the authorization of legislation by the proposed 28th Amendment, and then the implementing legislation itself. One must admit that there is hardly a public clamor for what I hope will become the 28th Amendment. Most Americans, I dare say, have never seriously considered the problem, not least, alas, because most political leaders have preferred to sweep the potential problem under the rug because it is too anxiety-provoking to think about. I frankly do not recall a public clamor in 1967 when the 25th Amendment was added to the Constitution. But, of course, the assassination of President Kennedy only 4 years before had led some to reflect on how the only thing worse than his assassination might have been his lingering in a comatose state for months before expiring. What explains the 25th Amendment, I believe, was the leadership shown by Congress, particularly Senator Cornyn's distinguished predecessor, then Senator Birch Bayh, B-A-Y-H, of Indiana. We are fortunate that Senator Cornyn is providing such leadership on this occasion, and I dearly hope that it will have the same success that Senator Bayh had some 37 years ago. The proposed amendment is actually quite modest. It simply allows Congress to address the issue for better or worse. It does not require a given solution at this point. Deciding on such a solution, of course, is no easy matter. I would welcome the opportunity to testify at a further date with regard to the details of possible implementing legislation. I will mention only what I think is the most serious potential problem with allowing governors an unrestricted discretion to fill vacant House seats. A single governor of a large state might be tempted to name only members of his or her own political party to the vacancies, with potential destabilizing consequences at a time when it would be maximally necessary for us to recall and to act upon Jefferson's reminder that we are all Democrats, all Republicans, united by a desire to serve our country. I believe that any succession procedure should contain safeguards against temptations to use a national crisis for partisan advantage. Yeah, Sandy was prescient. My own preference would be to have each member of Congress deposit with the governor a letter containing a short list of preferred successors, should this occasion ever arise, with the governor required to choose from that list. No doubt there are other potential solutions, but Congress need never discuss any of them unless it first possesses authority to pass relevant legislation. And that authority would be provided by the amendment. Horse, cart, right? None of these things is easy to talk about. As one of the participants, himself a member of the House of Representatives, in the AEI Brookings lunch last year, commented, "No one enjoys thinking about the possibility of his or her death, let alone the kind of mass death that was experienced on September 11th. But this does not, I'm thinking of those 3,000 lives, if that, the other planes, the Pennsylvania plane, that could have been 6,000 lives that day. But this does not stop most of us, even when quite young, from drawing up wills or buying insurance, because we recognize the responsibility that we have to our children and family to provide a stable succession, as it were, for our sadly inevitable deaths. This is especially the case, I might add, if we die not at the end of long and fruitful lives, but rather as a result of accidents or other entirely unexpected events. So it is with members of the House and Senate. You daily must wrestle with awesome and sometimes awful issues. This is one of those issues. The one happy thing that can be said, though, is that this is also one of those issues that have no partisan dimension. I hope that Congress responds quickly to what can now be recognized as a truly serious imperfection in our present Constitution. Okay, takeaway. Nonpartisan action. 2004, after 9/11, that was still echoing in our memories rather loudly, right? Sandy Levinson identified issues early in his scholarly career, if that's the right way to describe it. That's why I put his name on my refrigerator. What if Sandy Levinson is right? We have to think about the Constitution as a document, a dynamic document. I'm trying to think of what else I put on my refrigerator. If there's anything else to talk about today. Oh, the FD2D. From dictatorship to democracy. I tongue slipped it and said from democracy to dictatorship. And I figure that probably wasn't a tongue slip so much as a reflection of the times we're living in now. So these emergencies can be fabricated. They can be engineered. Jan 6 was an attempt at engineering such a catastrophic loss. We have to understand the mechanics, y'all. So anyway, that gives you some insight as to why I'm focused in some areas. What I wrote on my refrigerator is what I think we focus on. Professor Danielle Allen's discussion in our declaration, that book has a broad scope in that it ties in political philosophy, it ties in traditional philosophy, and then political philosophy, and contemporary life. She brings that together and applies the Constitution in a reading that punctuation makes a difference. And she presents equality. She makes a good argument for equality. So we can focus on certain things. From democracy to dictatorship, how are we going to get back to democracy? That's a handbook. Focus on strategies. I ran across people snipping. There was a comment on YouTube. Well, who's the leader? Who's the leader of the resistance? Whatever you want to call it. Who's the leader for this moment? And it was a pile-on. We don't need a leader. This is da-da-da-da. Well, we have to have a strategy and we have to have organization. I don't care what you call it. We can't succeed in any big plans if we don't organize. And if we have to have a spokesperson, fine, don't call him a leader. Call him a spokesperson. Whatever. Just realize what we're up against. Okay, there's Quilly with lipstick on.